So I wanted to kind of connect all the issues with the Constitution from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution um, before we move on. And I think that it will explain some things. Um, you had a lot of issues with with how they were going to set up this government. The First Continental Congress, take that back, the Second Continental Congress had instituted the Articles of Confederation. And a confederation, by definition, is a loose group of nations or states that work together somewhat. That's basically it. Like the Confederate States of America were like that, were a confederation. However, the problem here is that they are not bound by an overarching set of principles at that point or laws. And so there were intentionally the Articles of Confederation were weak. So after several years of this, they instituted this Articles of Confederation early on in the war, so that they would have some sort of government during this process. Well, the Articles were allowed to continue on after the war, and finally, after the Shays Rebellion, people saw that the government was not strong enough to handle some of the issues that might come up. So in their quest to maintain a small government with limited powers, they had made it so weak that it really was paralyzed. It couldn't do anything. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't even deal with the military. Every state was making their own laws. They're making their own trade agreements with other nations. So, they're making treaties with nations state by state. It would be like Georgia making its own treaty with Mexico. So these things did not really work well, and they figured this out after a while, that the government just did not have enough power, and it was going to have to be a little bit stronger than it was. So the question then becomes, how much power, who gets the power, those kinds of things. So we'll talk about those a little bit before we move on. So you have to remember that now we could trade with European nations for our own benefit, make our own deals, not worry about what England had to say about it. Americans were negatively affected by Britain's conflicts with everybody else, and they were in conflict a lot. They did lose the defense of the western frontier in the backcountry. The backcountry is anything that's more than 50 miles off the Atlantic seaboard. So that encompasses most of the colonies, if you only count the 50 miles as being, everything else is frontier. So you have a very small strip of settled land, so to speak. Southern colonies and then states had been prominently Anglican. So their religion, because the Anglican Church was a British institution, their religion, they were kind of at a loss as to what to do next, because the Anglican Church basically pulls out. The modern version of the Anglican Church is the Episcopal Church now, today, if that's what, so you would see that here. That would be the Anglican Church. So the United States has different advantages than the other people in the world. Physical isolation from Europe, from the old world, is a definite advantage for the United States at this point. They don't have this constant conflict. Europe was at war all the time between 1789 and 1815, so they weren't dragged into all of that. They were already bigger than France, Great Britain, and Spain combined. The population in the United States was young. They were energetic. They were ready to move west. They were ready to work. to improve their lot in life. And so that energy served this new country very well. If you think about it, old people didn't really show up from Great Britain from any time, from, you know, even from the earliest days. They were too old. So you had a youthful group that was willing to head out, you know, on a ship and to come over here and settle. You had a broad distribution of property ownership that you did not have in Europe. You had to be very wealthy or noble in order to own property, and you really, if you weren't, you didn't have any hope of property ownership. So here there was land for the taking. You know, this land, they didn't really care that the Indians had been on it, and so they just took it. And so the government then takes over, and they start divvying up all the land that they had gotten in the Revolution. And so there's land to be had for all these young people. So they're ready to take off in their wagons headed west. Literacy among whites is at a high because they were all taught to read so that they could read the Bible. So you have a relatively educated population going on here. So there are a lot of things that are going well for the United States at this point. So the question is, how are the states going to develop? How are they going to determine who gets what powers? The local government, the state government, the central government, which then becomes the federal government, of course. You have to always balance the sectional interest, meaning the North and the South, slave versus free states, those kinds of things. And then how is this national authority going to all balance out? And who's going to be considered full-fledged members, American citizens? Who are going to be the beneficiaries of this liberty that they just, you know, fought for in the war? Is it going to be it's not going to be the enslaved population, not going to basically be the women. So basically it's going to be white males. Then you have to decide, is it going to be all white males or is it going to be the rich white males, and how are you going to determine that criteria? So you had this Articles of Confederation. It took them 4 years to ratify this document. So they didn't ratify this document by these states until 1781. Basically the war was over before it was actually ratified. Now it was working because it had to, but the states had to all approve it. It was going to balance this need for this. Somebody had to coordinate the war, so that had to be the one and only legislative body that there was, the Congress, and they were worried that the central power of the political power was going to be a danger to their newfound liberty. They declared this government a perpetual union, but it basically looks like a treaty for we're going to defend each other more than a government blueprint. So it's going to be this firm league of friendship. It's not going to be a government framework. It's we're going to stick it out, but there's not really no specifics. The states basically made a treaty. Now this perpetual union, you will see this come back up when we get to the Civil War, because this is the premise. This perpetual union takes shape in 1777, and it sets us up for the Civil War that early on, nearly 90 years before the Civil War. This perpetual union, that word, makes a big difference for Lincoln, because Lincoln is going to defend that perpetual union, meaning he says the South can't secede. So you will hear that again. The 13 states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So it's all about, you had 13 states working independent of each other. You had a national government. You had a one-house Congress, and each state cast one vote. So that's 13 states, 13 votes. Consider how that makes the people feel in Virginia, who have many, many more people than the people do in West Virginia. West Virginia, Rhode Island. Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the smallest state, fewest people, and so they're not too happy. They're happy about this. The Virginians are not so happy. There was no president, there was no judiciary, there was nothing but Congress. So if you took out the president and you took out the Supreme Court and all the court system, that's what you would get now. Major decisions required the approval of 9 states rather than a simple majority, meaning basically a little, well, 51%. So they made it very hard. They also made it very hard with the Articles of Confederation, that it had to have unanimous approval in order to ditch this document. The document could not be ditched without the unanimous approval. Well, now I've got 4 girls, and I can't get them to organize a trip to a restaurant. We can't decide to go eat where to go eat, and there's 4 of them. Can you imagine trying to get 13 states to approve anything at all unanimously? Not going to happen. So they locked themselves into something that they couldn't get themselves out of, and so we'll see how that happens in a minute. The only thing that the Articles of Confederation could do, it was all about the war. They could declare war, they could conduct foreign affairs, they could make treaties with other governments. That was it. Congress had no they had no money other than what the states decided that they would throw in. They could make their own money. So you had 13 states printing and coining their own money. That means that Alabama would have Georgia and South Carolina would have different money than did the other, North Carolina or Virginia. Everybody had their own money. They couldn't levy taxes. They couldn't regulate commerce. So that's where the states were making their own business deals with other nations. They were not paying their taxes, because who's going to pay their taxes if they don't absolutely have to? The revenue was contributed by these individual states, and if you were going to amend the Articles of Confederation, you had to have unanimous consent. You're never going to get that to happen. So in the 1780s, their most important accomplishment in Congress was that they were able to establish control over this Northwest territory, this unorganized territory that they had acquired in the war. Britain had moved out, so you had all of this land that has to be divided. If you look at Georgia, look how different Georgia looks than what it is now. This is part of West Florida. So it was originally East and West Florida, and it was under Spain's control. So Georgia had a very different shape than it does now. So these charters had granted all of the territory all the way to the South Sea, which was the Pacific Ocean, and they didn't care who was on it. This is just what the charters had all said based on the colonial charters back in the colonial period. So now things are a little different. It did allow Virginia and Connecticut and the Carolinas, they claimed all this land west to the Pacific Ocean. Land speculators, politicians, settlers from states, they insisted that the land had to have to belong to the nation as a whole. So that meant that Virginia, Connecticut, and the Carolinas had to give up their land that they said that they owned. So they gave up their land for the good of the nation, which was a pretty big deal. The Articles were ratified after these states ceded their land to the central government. So you have to establish these rules for what we're going to do with this land. If you go back and look, what were you going to do with all this land? How are you going to decide who gets it? I mean, you don't have anything. There's nobody much out there, just some Native Americans, which that should count for something, but it didn't. So how are we going to divide this land up that we've suddenly got acquired? And let me tell you, the New Americans were glad to be able to go west of the Appalachian Mountains that were about right here. They had not been really allowed, per the proclamation of 1763, they were not allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so now they had all this land suddenly open, so they were all itching to go. So they had to figure out how to divide the land up all the way to the Mississippi River. You had 100,000 Indians living there. They were not going to be happy. So the Congress, their justification is this: by fighting with the British, on the side of the British, the Indians had forfeited their right to the land there. So since the British lost, the Indians lost, and so now it's ours. So the British gave it up, so that meant the Indians gave it up too. There was not a big distinction between any of this, between the Indians that fought for Britain and the Indians that were neutral in this. They didn't care. the Americans set up Fort Stanwix at New York and Fort McIntosh, which is now at Pittsburgh, and that was to defend that western territory. Americans wanted to get lots of land north of the Ohio River, and so these were like the treaties that they had signed with the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw in the South. The government was pressed because the farmers wanted access, but they also to this land, and they really wanted it free or not much money. But the new government needed a way to raise revenue. So what they wanted to do is to take it and divide it up and sell it off in order to pay off, because the Congress had assumed the Revolutionary War debts of all the states, and because the states couldn't pay their Revolutionary War debts. So the Congress is looking for ways to raise money. So now that there's peace and people aren't, fighting this war, they're ready to head west. They go up to the upstate New York, over the Appalachian Mountains into what is now Kentucky and Tennessee. They wanted this land, and taking possession of this western land was a symbol of their freedom now that they had freedom to do these things. Just like the British colonial officials had worried, the new leaders were worried about how they were going to have constant warfare with all this 100,000 Indians who lived here east of the Mississippi but west of the new states. So they knew that it was going to be an issue with the Native Americans were going to have a problem. You had these land ordinances all through the 1780s. You had land ordinances, basically laws that explained how the land was going to be divvied up, divided. So Ordinance of 1784 was drafted by Jefferson, and it talks about the stages for the West, how you're going to have a territory. And they divided these districts that were governed by Congress, and they would eventually be admitted to the Union, but they were territories. And so you had maybe the Ohio Territory, and once the population in the Ohio Territory reached the same level as the smallest state as far as population, so if the population of the smallest state was 60,000, then the territory population had to reach 60,000 in order to apply for union, for statehood. And so they had to apply to Congress. They had only one vote that Congress rejected this move that would have prohibited slavery in the West. If they had had one more vote, it would have solved a whole lot of problems. So you think about, one vote. When you think that one vote doesn't count, one vote very definitely counts. You had the Land Ordinance of 1785. This regulated land sales in the region as well, and all of that Northwest Territory. This was the old Northwest. It was surveyed by the government, and it was sold in sections of a square mile, which were 640 acres, for $1 an acre. Now, so you say, 640 acres for $640, that's a great deal. It is in today's money. Back then, $640 was a lot of money. So it was not quite the deal. What you had was land speculators who did have cash, and they would go out there, and the minimum purchase was 640 acres. And so they would go out, sell it, buy it, subdivide it, and then sell it off in smaller plots to people who couldn't afford 640 acres. So they would sell off 5 or 10 acres or 25 acres for a higher price. So land speculators made a lot of money off of this. In every township, one section had to be sold, and that money was spent on public education. So every township, you had an acre that was allowed for public education, for schools, basically, and that was one of Thomas Jefferson's stipulations. The Land Ordinance of 1787, people are dying for land, so Congress says we're going to sell it to private groups. They had 1.5 million acres sold to the Ohio Company, and they were northeastern land speculators and then former army officers. The settlers got a reduced price for this government land, but there was no more of this after the Land Ordinance of 1787. There was no more until the Homestead Act of 1862. So you had the eventual establishment. They planned on 3 to 5 states north of the Ohio River, which was here, and east of the Mississippi River. So we're talking about all of this land. The territorial expansion, self-government, and they were gonna treat the Indians right. They were not going to take it without their consent. The colonies and the states, though, had a hard time with this because they would make treaties with the Native Americans. They would either get them drunk and have them sign treaties that were dishonest. They wouldn't abide by the treaties they signed. They cheated these Native Americans out of a lot of land. So when you think that, you know, these people were noble and all, not so much. They were not quite nearly as noble as, you know, they've been made out to be in the past. So you have all of this Northwest Territory. You see, it's the UP of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all of this area, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. So, but between treaties, voluntary removal, and purchase, Native Americans disappeared. Slavery was prohibited in this part of the country. However, slave owners brought these enslaved people into the area anyway, and they said that they lied and said that these enslaved people were working under long-term labor contracts and that they had voluntarily signed those, and that was obviously a lie. But that's how they got away with bringing enslaved people into this area. You have Shays' Rebellion, and in 1786, 1787, you have these farmers who closed the courts down. They basically took over the courts and shut them down so that they could not seize the land, because the owners of these farms were poor. They were former Revolutionary War soldiers, and they had no money. The economy was terrible. You had a fledgling country, and so the taxes were really high because the states were trying to recoup their money in order to pay their debts on the Revolutionary War, their war debts. So they were taxing the very people who had fought this war. So Daniel Shays is in western Massachusetts, and he and a bunch of the friends get out and they say, we're going to close down these courts so they can't take our land. If the judges won't come work and seize our land, then they can't take it. So they shut this place down. Benjamin Lincoln, who had been in the Revolutionary War, he brings the army out and they deal with Daniel Shays. What this really does, by January of 1787, it was over. But what this proves to the framers, the founding fathers, is that you cannot, they knew that the Articles of Confederation were not going to work because they had no way of really, there was no control. There was no government control of these protests, and they were afraid that the protests would break out throughout the states and that the whole Union would fall apart. So they realized, you know, by 1787 that something had to give, early 1787. So this is a comparison of the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. The states were sovereign under the Articles of Confederation. There was no independent executive branch, meaning no president. There were no federal courts, so there was no judiciary. The Congress could not tax. Congress was unicameral, one house. So that means there was no House and Senate. There was just Congress, one vote per state. You had to make any amendments at all. You had to have 100% of the states approve it. Never going to happen. Congress did have special powers, and the only states were the ones who could deal with people directly. In the Constitution, you had the people who were sovereign. You had the independent executive, which was the president, who was elected by electoral college. Separate court system. Congress could collect taxes, duties, and excise tax. Congress was bicameral, meaning you have a House and a Senate. It could be Constitution could be amended if you had 3/4 of the states that approved. Congress had special and implied powers, and the states and federal government acted on people directly. Congress could regulate commerce with states and other nations. So those are pretty big differences. The effects of Shays' Rebellion. It convinced this influential group that the national government had to have more uniform economic policies, and they had to protect property owners from infringements on rights by local majorities. This is part of where we get our Bill of Rights. This is where they come up with this idea of the Bill of Rights, that there has to be specific civil rights outlined. They said it was dangerous to individual rights, was not from the central government, but from the people as a whole. Private liberty, especially property rights, were endangered by public liberty, meaning that the will of the people was not necessarily what was important, that the individual rights were more important. This unchecked power in the hands of the people, like these revolts, was going to be bad for the individual liberties of people in general, small, every person. You have this nationalism in the 1780s. This is James Madison. He was about 120 pounds, and he was about 5'3". He weighed about 120 pounds, dripping wet, but he was very, very smart. Alexander Hamilton, this is him. He was all about business. He had a brilliant business mind, banking, those kinds of things, and he was well known in the world. He was concerned that we were squandering independence and our chance at future greatness, and wanted enhanced national authority to combat that. They wanted the influential economic interests, meaning the business people in the Northeast particularly wanted a stronger national government. They wanted stronger ties to Great Britain because of the economic relationships that we had had with them before statehood. So back in the colonial days, they had this great bond with England economically, and they wanted to go back to that because England was going to be their biggest business partner, basically. Urban artisans, people who were making, who are creating, making things with skill in the cities, wanted tariff protection, which means that they wanted a tax to be imposed. A tariff is a tax. They wanted a tax to be imposed on all goods being brought in, imports. So what they were saying was, if you buy something, if you can buy a dress made in the United States for $20, you need to put a tax on a British dress of $5 extra so that it's an incentive to buy the cheaper product. You're going to protect the urban people in the United States by making the imports more expensive. And that's supposed to be an incentive to the people at home to buy domestically. So if I have to pay $25 for a dress from England, or I can buy a $20 dress from somebody made in the United States, chances are I'm going to buy the $20 dress. So that's their idea. Merchants wanted access to British markets, and they were worried that states were going to interfere with property rights. In September of 1786, the delegates from 6 states get together at Annapolis, and they try to figure out a way to better run the country, to regulate trade, to regulate interstate commerce, meaning commerce between states. So they say, okay, let's have a convention in Philadelphia, and we're going to amend these Articles of Confederation. May of 1787, this is Independence Hall, what we now know as Independence Hall, and it's in Philadelphia. Oh no. and it is now surrounded by high-rises. But you can go here, if you go to Philadelphia, you can go here and see this. It was known as the Pennsylvania State House at the time. We call it Independence Hall. Everybody was there in May of 1787 except for Rhode Island. It was, now remember we said that the Articles of Confederation required 100% approval from all states to be amended. Well, they couldn't amend it. The charge was for them to go and amend this document. They got to Philadelphia in May and they said, this is just too big a mess, we can't do it. They just totally trashed the Articles of Confederation without any state approval at all. What they did was illegal. It was not a legal move. So when you say, oh, the government now is so corrupt, they do all these illegal things. No, they started off illegal because they scrapped a document. If you think about if Congress went and scrapped a document now like that, the uproar that we would have. So anyway, they draft this new Constitution, 55 men. They're lawyers, merchants, planters, large farmers. You have people who were not there, men like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams was an ambassador to England at this time. You had George Washington was back at home in Virginia, Mount Vernon, and Thomas Jefferson was in France as an ambassador to France. So you had the people who were there for the Declaration of Independence were not here at this time. This was a different set of people. But you had 55 people. Only a tenth, 1 in 10 of the citizens had been to college. Of all the citizens in the United States, 1 in 10 had been to college. In this group, you had a very educated group of people. Over 50% had attended college of this 55. So these people were wealthy. They were had high social status, and they were educated. They had this common belief that we had to strengthen the national authority and to curb the excesses of democracy. So this is the idea. They met in secret. They kept closed windows even though it was very warm, and they didn't want anybody to know what was going on behind closed doors. Curbing the excess of democracy. They did not want the masses to vote. They did not believe that the masses of people had the sense to vote. They didn't think they were educated or wise enough to do so. So they end up, each state institutes property qualifications, meaning you have to have accumulated so much wealth. It could be land, house, enslaved property, human property. So you had to have accumulated so much wealth, and every state did their own thing about their property qualifications. Every state said you had to be a white male, of course, but then beyond that, you would have to have a certain amount of property in order to be allowed to vote. So people say, oh, the Founding Fathers intended for everybody to vote. No, they did not. They absolutely did not, and they would be blown away if they came back and found out who all was voting now. Women, all sorts of minorities, people who did not have property. They would be flipped out to know that, because the idea was not that everybody was going to vote, that some people were going to vote. So you were going to have 3 branches. James Madison Jefferson was in France, so James Madison is in Virginia at Montpelier, near Jefferson's home outside Charlottesville. Well, Madison writes to Jefferson and says, please send me all the books you can find about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, all of the philosophers of the day, the social philosophers, the political thinkers. And so Jefferson sends him boxes and boxes of books. Madison locks himself in his study and reads for 6 months everything he can come up with, because at this time there was no democracy existing in the world. This was a total experiment. The most recent democracy was ancient Greece. So they had no model on which to do this. So this was a pretty big deal, and had Madison, if he was not smart, this would never have worked. So they want Congress to be able to raise money without relying on the states to do it, because the states didn't want to pony up their money. States were prohibited from infringing on property rights. government represents the people. There was supposed to be a balance between the monarchies and the aristocracies, and then the excesses of popular self-government. So what they did, they didn't want a monarchy. They did not want the rich people only voting, but they also didn't want everybody voting. So they had to find a happy medium. You had to balance the claims of liberty and power. So you have to find this balance between power and freedom, which is a very hard thing to do. You have you have large versus small states. You remember we said that with the Articles of Confederation, every state had one vote. Well, that didn't work too well for the people of Virginia and these bigger states because they had a lot of people. It's not really fair for Rhode Island, who has very few people, to have as much power in the Congress as Virginia does, and they have, many, many more people. So you have these issues. You have the Virginia Plan, which is James Madison's idea of a two-house legislature, which helps this situation. You had Virginia Plan was going to be representative of the people. They wanted it was going to favor the big states. So they wanted the population to determine how they were represented in these states that had lots of people: Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. At this point, Massachusetts goes up into what is present-day Maine, so it's much bigger than it is now. So this Virginia Plan was going to have all Congress. You're going to have all of Congress was going to be based on population of every state. The New Jersey Plan says that you get one vote per state, and that's it. Easy peasy, that's all. So they had a compromise, and it's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. You have a two-house Congress with a Senate. They now have 2 representatives per state. They have 6-year terms. This allows the Senate to be insulated from these sudden shifts of public opinion, meaning if you only have to be elected every 6 years, you can do some things that might be a little more risky politically or radical because you can't be voted out immediately. It's not like if you're in for 6 years, that's a good long time, and things change politically in 6 years. So it's not because you're not reelected, but every 6 years, there's not such a shift. The House is based on population, and that means that so however many people you have in your state, you get so many representatives per 1,000 people, however many thousands of people. For example, Georgia has 16 representatives. It's grown a lot. When I was in school years and years ago in middle and high school, we had 11 representatives. So that makes a big difference. Also, you do need to know that your electoral college votes, when you go to vote for the president, we have 16 delegates. So however many representatives in the House of Representatives that you have the same number of electoral college votes when it's time to vote for the president. So these 2-year terms the House was intended to be much more representative of public opinion, and they was much more responsive to public opinion, because if I have to be elected every 2 years, I'm going to have to listen to what the people in my district say, and I'm going to have to go and listen to what they have to say and what they want me to do as a result. Otherwise, I won't be reelected if I don't do what the people want me to do. So it's much more responsive to the people's will than the Senate is. And the Senate too, it's only 2 per state. This is this could be expanded a lot based on your population. Like right now we have 435 representatives in the House of Representatives. You didn't always have that. When the country was much smaller, it was still based on population. It was a lot less people. The question is this. You have the 3/5 compromise, and this is a big deal. Virginia and the southern states said, but we want to count our enslaved population. That's a huge amount, because they wanted power in Congress. So all of a sudden they want to count all their enslaved population as if they were citizens. Well, but they're not citizens. You're not allowing them to vote. You don't let them, they're not citizens. They don't have a right to a jury trial. They don't have all sorts of things that citizens, all sorts of rights, but yet you want to count them. The other issue was that so up in New England, they didn't have slaves. Not to the extent they had slaves, but they didn't have it to the extent that the South did. So that was not really going to be fair. However, the South's power in Congress is always more. They always have more power in Congress because of this 3/5 compromise than the New England states do. They have more people, and then they have this 3/5 compromise, so they do have more power, and they use that power as leverage. Now, the hypocrisy of the whole thing is that while the southern states wanted to count these enslaved people in their population counts for their representation in Congress, they didn't want to pay taxes on those same people. They're not citizens. So why should we pay taxes? And that's not property, so why should we pay taxes? Well, they can't have it both ways, but they did kind of get it both ways for a while. So anyway, what they were going to do is they counted these people as 3/5 of a person. You can look at it that way, which is pretty offensive. Or you can look at it as they took their population of 100 enslaved people and they counted 3/5 of that one population. So they would take 3/5 of 100, and that would be, rather than dividing a person into 3/5, it's kind of offensive. It's an offensive visual. But anyway, so you have this 3/5 compromise, and it's had to do with how they were counting these people for representation and taxation purposes. This expansion of democracy, this is not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. Like we said earlier, they didn't mean for the masses to be voting. However, the way that they chose the House of Representatives and the fact that they only had 2-year terms was a move towards this expansion of democracy, because it was a more responsive body of people, of representatives, and they were directly elected. To start with, the senators were chosen. They were by an electoral college type situation, and they changed that to a direct vote, but they were not ready to do that at the time. They allowed direct election of the House of Representatives to start with. Congress didn't have property or religious qualifications for voting. They made sure that the states took care of that, and that was a nod towards the states' writers. That was, giving up something so the states' rights people wouldn't fuss quite so much. It was less than democratic. People talk about, it was Democrat, we have a democracy. Nope, not quite. They wanted to make sure that the quote-unquote right kind of men held office. They didn't want just anybody in office. The House of Representatives, where we had 465 now, there were 65 in the House of Representatives. The Massachusetts Assembly had 200 representatives in their state assembly, so it was much more open to democratic ideals. There were more people, and there was a lot more representation than that was in the House of Representatives. They wanted only prominent men to hold office. They didn't want any direct election of judges or president, which federal judges are appointed. The president is elected by electoral college. So the Supreme Court was appointed by presidents for life terms, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate, approved by the Senate. So why would people care about the Supreme Court? Why would a president care about being able to appoint a Supreme Court justice? The main reason is if that Supreme Court justice is in for life, he's going to be there long after that president is gone. And so the president has a lot of power. If he can get a Supreme Court justice in that believes as he does, and he's in there for life, then that means that president's power will go on for a long, long time through the Supreme Court. The election system was confusing. You don't have to know all the details, but they did not trust ordinary voters to choose the president and the vice president directly. So that is something you do need to know. At the beginning, you didn't have running mates. The president was the person who got the most votes, and the person who got the second most votes would be the vice president. Which the problem there was that once you got into the parties after 1800 or so, you got into parties, you could have a situation like with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, where you had a president from one party and a vice president from another party, and they didn't get anything done because they fought all the time, because they didn't agree with each other. So that was an issue. You have this separation of powers. They just talked about this for 4 months. You have federalism, which is the division of powers, and then you have these checks and balances between all of these different branches. So you have this relationship between the national government and the states. The Constitution strengthened national authority a great deal. The president was to enforce the law and command the military. The Congress was to levy taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, declare war, deal with foreign nations and the Indians. Look at the power. They kept the power here in Congress, and then they were very limiting on the president because they were scared of getting into a monarchical situation like they had, where the president turns out to be basically a king. So you see how Congress has all the power here because they are elected by the people. States were barred from issuing paper money, so that means you can't print your own money anymore. You can't have contracts. You can't do your export and import duties, but you can have the right to do education, law enforcement, the things that are not stipulated by the Constitution. One of the good things is that Congress could pass the laws, but the president can veto. The other thing is that you had to have, if the Congress was seriously about not, if they didn't agree with the president, with his veto, you could have a 2/3 majority to override it. So the president could veto it, but if the Congress felt very strongly about it and could get up the votes of 2/3 majority, they could override his veto. Federal judges were nominated by the president, but Congress has to approve them, and that's the way it is today. So that the judges were independent of the political environment and were not supposed to be swayed by politics, which in the Supreme Court, that's not exactly how it's turned out to be in the last 30 years, because the Supreme Court justices have become increasingly politically influenced. Judges were meant to serve for life. The president can be impeached or tossed out. The House of Representatives has to introduce the legislation to have a trial for the president, and then he can be removed from office by the Senate for high crimes and misdemeanors. Has not happened. They impeached Bill Clinton, but they did not have the votes to actually impeach him. They had the trial, but he was not voted out. You have more and more slavery debates because of the Fugitive Slave Clause that said that that the North, if you were in the North and you found a runaway slave, you were supposed to return him or her to the rightful owner in the South, and that went against the abolitionist beliefs of the New Englanders. They were not too happy with the Three-Fifths Clause. They wanted strict limits on congressional power, and they were worried that they were going to tax their human property in the future. So they were trying to make sure that Congress couldn't impose outrageous taxes. Slavery in the Constitution is not really dealt with, other than because they knew that the South would not ratify the Constitution, and so they chose to ratify the Constitution over fighting the slave issue at this juncture. The founding fathers believed that slavery would have to be dealt with at some point. They were hoping it would go away, and that if it didn't, that future generations would have to deal with it. But they knew that right now they had to set up a government that was actually going to be able to function, and so they chose to do that. And that's part of the South's holding the rest of the country hostage over slavery, which is what they did. They used their power to fight the slavery battle. So what they were saying was that between 1787 and January 1 of 1808, they imported 170,000 Africans. They would have time, when the framers said the Congress will have the option, January 1, 1808, in the Constitution, it says that they would have the option, the Congress would have the option to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, meaning they couldn't import any more Africans for slavery purposes. If they chose to do that, they didn't have to choose it, but they were hoping they would. So what happens is the framers said, well, you've got next 20 years to deal with this. You can, you just have at it. So that as far as, you can import all you please between now and then, but January 1, 1808, it will be up for a vote. So they imported 170,000 Africans to make up for the escaped slaves who had gone with the British. And they had left when the British left. The escaped enslaved people went to Britain, mostly to Canada, which was still British. And so these people had left, and so they were making up their lost property. The Fugitive Slave Clause said that a person, the condition of the person, meaning if he is free or a slave, the condition follows him no matter where he goes. If he goes to a free state, then it doesn't really matter because his condition follows him. And the Constitution didn't give the national government any authority to interfere with slavery in any state. You had the 3/5 clause that was put into the Constitution to satisfy the South, and then you had if you look, and this was just trivia, of the first 16 presidential elections, all but 4 had Southern slaveholders in the White House. That tells you how much power the slave states held. If you had all but 4, you had 75% were from Southern states. The ratification debate, meaning that once 9 states had approved this Constitution, it would be ratified and it would go into effect. So they had all these conventions in the states, and they had all these battles. They had pamphlets and newspaper articles and campaigns. This is where you get the Federalist Papers, and you may have read some of that in high school. They wrote all of these essays, these 85 essays. You had Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and they all wrote under the name Publius, and they put it into a book in 1788, but it was in the newspapers, and it's considered one of the most important tomes ever written. Back then, though, it was just a bunch, much like the Great Awakening, it was just a bunch of political propaganda. The Anti-Federalists, we'll get into this as well later on, but they're not as organized. Sam Adams was an Anti-Federalist, Patrick Henry and George Mason. These 2 guys were from Virginia. Sam Adams was from Massachusetts. He's John Adams' cousin. So they were concerned that the federal government would have too much power, and so they didn't want this for the Virginians, particularly because they were afraid that if Congress had too much power, they would abolish slavery. So slavery is over is holding the South hostage from day one because they know that people in the North are against it. So the Anti-Federalists, they did write essays and things, but they were not nearly. You had 92 from the Federalist and only 12 from the Anti-Federalist. So the 9 states had ratified this. The necessary 9 states had ratified it by 1788. Madison tells them that the first Congress is going to enact a Bill of Rights, and that gets the South. South was adamant that there had to be a Bill of Rights. So that's where you get the first 10 amendments. And so Madison had promised that the first Congress would take care of this. Rhode Island and North Carolina were late to the party. They didn't necessarily want to ratify it, so they took their own sweet time. So you have this Bill of Rights. Madison says it's redundant, it's ridiculous, we don't need to do it, but he did it. He did it because the South required it in order to ratify. Most of the citizens believed it needed to be done, and those amendments were ratified by 1791. Obviously, you've got freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, arrest. You couldn't arrest without warrants, those kinds of things. They did recognize religious freedom. The Constitution has no reference to God, no religious test for federal office holders. There's no legislating religion. There's which was a departure from the British Constitution and colonial precedent. In the 20th century, this freedom of speech became a big deal, so that people could say what they wanted to. It's vital to democracy. So you don't want governments to control what people are able to say or express. There should be no control of that, because if you do, you then get into, it's a slippery slope to dictatorship. Indians, they did not want, with regard to the Indians, the framers did not know exactly what they needed to do with these Indians, but they thought that the land was theirs. So they didn't know what to do about it. It was sort of like slavery. They were not too sure what to do about it, but they knew that that land in the West was going to be theirs. Expansion was a given, and so you had these options. You could move them farther west. You could have total removal, or you could allow them to incorporate into white civilization. The tribes got no representation in Congress. The treaty system was okay, but it just kept transferring land to the federal government, and many of these treaties were not honored. Blacks at the time under the Constitution, the African American population was greatly outnumbered the Indian population. The status of the free blacks in New England was undetermined. They were working on gradual emancipation, meaning people would be emancipated over time, and they would be manumitted, meaning they would get their freedom. Majority were not even considered by the people who were writing the Constitution. They were not even on the radar. Their rights were not on the radar. You had the Naturalization Act of 1790. How are we going to deal with immigrants? And this changes a lot with Alien and Sedition Acts once John Adams takes over, and we'll learn more about those in the next couple of weeks. And I'll stop there.